Welcome, everybody. I'm really pleased that we have such a terrific group assembled for today's seminar. I'm Rebecca Maynard and the chair of the board of the American Academy of Political and Social Science. The mission of the Academy is to advance science and public policy by bringing research to bear on critical social problems, and this is one of our events to that end. This was a bold mission of the Academy in normal times, and in the face of this pandemic, I have to say it feels somewhat daunting. But as my colleague, economist Doug Harris pointed out in one of his recent Brookings blogs, talking about what we had learned from Katrina that can help us through this pandemic, there are major adversities out there, and they are going to force us to adapt and innovate. Over time, we're going to find comfort in some of those adaptations and innovations, probably not in all. And there will be a range of downstream consequences, some of which will build strength and improvements for the future. So my word of optimism. I want to note that this seminar is co-sponsored by the School of Education and Human Development at George Washington University, and was jointly planned under the leadership of the Academy's Executive Director, Tom Tutchkamethi, and Dean Michael Fourier at George Washington University. And they, along with Jessica and our featured discussants, are really responsible for assembling all of you and for framing our conversation about the challenges and tough decisions that our school leaders and communities and parents and students are going to be facing as we prepare for serving children in the coming school year and beyond. So we've asked three prominent educators and education leaders to kick off the conversation by sharing their perspectives on issues such as dealing with learning losses and the increased disparities caused by the shortened school year and the need to move much of the instruction online, while also worrying about their own health, the health and safety of students, teachers, staff, and finances, and everything else they've got on their plate. So I'm going to turn the floor over to our first discussant, Carl Cohen, who had an unusually long and highly successful tenure as an educator and education leader, culminating in his tenure as superintendent of the Long Beach Unified School District. And I think he actually got the award for the longest tenure as a superintendent in the nation at some point, but he can correct me if I'm wrong there. And he's faced many tough battles as he strove to raise the achievement and persistence of students in that district, which I think give him a unique perspective on what school leaders and staff are struggling with today. So I'm going to turn it over to Carl.
Thanks, Becca. Hosting a podcast was not on my bucket list. And I was approached in early June by a California ed media outlet, EdSource, and a Sacramento lobbying firm, and asked the question, would you like to host? We'd like to capture the real-time voices of practitioner leaders who are struggling with this. Would you like to host a weekly podcast interviewing these leaders? My reaction was, I'm older, I'm not a techie, I don't know anything about producing a podcast. So all that's been taken care of, and since July 1st, the podcast has launched. I've identified 6 major challenges that school leaders are facing, and I'd be happy to share that with the organizers who can pass it on to the participants after the program. But these are interviews first with California school superintendents, and these are some of the challenges that they're facing. First of all, in our state, which has 6 million plus students, there are perhaps 1.2 million students without access to the internet. And in the podcast, superintendents have continuously raised the issue, how is that possible? in a state that is home to the Silicon Valley. How is that possible in a state where the Supreme Court has already ruled that access to curricular materials are a fundamental right that must be provided by school districts? One of the superintendents last week wondered aloud, with all due respect to the governor, the first partner, and the state superintendent, who've been feverishly raising money since March to close the divide, how can this be the domain of private philanthropy at this late date, when we may be facing a full year of distance learning? An important seminal question. Second challenge, collective bargaining agreements are now driven by huge debates on the issue of where distance learning will be delivered from. Some school districts arguing that in order for school principals to monitor equitable implementation, instruction should be delivered from school sites, and teacher unions vigorously pushing back on health and safety issues. At a recent webinar conducted statewide by the California Department of Education, the state's chief epidemiologist was on the webinar, and she said, teachers are more likely to catch the virus from other adults. And so if teachers do, in fact, come back to campus, the worst thing that could happen would be that faculty lounges, where everybody's relaxing, taking their masks off, could be a super spreader environment for the virus. So all kinds of issues around cleaning, sanitizing, have to be in play. The third major challenge, inadequate resources for testing, contact tracing, and PPE infrastructure needed for high quality distance learning. Most districts concede that the switch to distance learning in March was put together on the fly. But if we're going to be in this as the new normal, far greater resources will be needed. This morning's LA Times featured a story about an initial legislative discussion about the possibility of raising new taxes on the wealthy to support that infrastructure need. The fourth challenge, guidance coming at school systems from directions. The governor, the state superintendent, county health directors, and the guidance isn't always clear. Governor Newsom, a couple weeks ago, issued a new guidance document that included a footnote that opens the door for in-person opening of elementary schools, even in the counties that are on the state's virus watch list. So you can imagine the reaction to that. First, is an elementary school K-5? Is it K-6? Or is an elementary school K-8, which Catholic schools are arguing that the definition of K-8 should extend to K-8. What are the researchers learning from other countries about the virus spread in elementary school settings? And I think there's an urgent need for that kind of information. The fifth challenge, the emergence of learning pods as a new parent-driven strategy of privilege that will no doubt exacerbate existing inequalities. I'm old enough, my only familiarity, this really dates me. For me, pods were part of a 1950s sci-fi classic, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where these extraterrestrials came, took over minds, emotions, and left you with this blank slate body of what you used to be. So pods is an incredibly interesting development. My good friend, Elam Kazemi at the University of Washington up in Seattle, sent me an email and said, Carl, this appeared on our college's listserv today. It's an advertisement for a learning coach. Are you looking for a new and unique teaching opportunity? We are seeking an energetic, creative, and motivated person to help facilitate the online education for 6 to 8 kids, grades 3 to 5 in our neighborhood micro school. The role is part-time, 4.5 hours a day in the classroom, in person, plus several hours a week of paid prep time outside the classroom. The role will facilitate children's instruction and assignments given from the school district, as well as provide additional learning through creating challenging and fun curriculum appropriate for the age group. We're looking for someone that can nurture a growth mindset, as well as the children's emotional, social, and physical side. You will be teaching. The teaching area is a daylight basement, plenty of lights, lots of space, 2 rooms for the learning coach to make it their own, plus private entry and exit. The backyard has a grassy field, trampoline, sport court for outdoor play during free choice or recess. The kids will have their own desks, laptops, tablets, and supplies. On and on and on about this as an attractive new opportunity to enrich youngsters' educations. And so the exacerbating inequity issues are really prominent with regard to the emergence of this sort of thing. Finally, the 6th challenge, a demand for new equity policies and conversations along those lines following the horrific events in Minnesota and elsewhere. Longtime partnerships with law enforcement getting increased scrutiny, cuts, and defunding in favor of counselors, social workers, mental health experts, and others. As someone who served as superintendent in the 2nd and 3rd largest school systems in California, I'm uneasy with quick and knee-jerk policy discussions that might not take into account how perceptions around school safety may influence middle-income parents of all colors in their decision to enroll their children in public schools. The other issue related is, what will the new student activism look like when we return in person? Mike Kirst and I were on a webinar last week with about 500 high school elected student leaders, and it's pretty clear that there's zeal and passion for change that they're going to lead when schools reopen. It hasn't abated. So those are 6 challenges that we're hearing about on the podcast. And I think it's important that we focus on, yes, what are we in terms of now, but what is this newfound student activism going to be when schools do in fact open in person? So that's 6 areas from me, and Becca, it's back to you.
Wow, sobering, but thank you, Carl. Messages we needed to hear. Our next discussant is Natalie Millman, who is a professor of education technology at George Washington University. And Natalie's an expert in the design of online technology and support, with a focus on issues of diversity, inclusion, and digital equity. So Natalie, I hope you have some brighter messages for us to maybe counteract or put us on a path to address some of the challenges that Carl just put before us.
Well, Carl, as some of you know, was my superintendent when I was an elementary school teacher in Long Beach Unified for 5, I think 4 of the 5 years, or maybe all 5 of the years that I taught there. Can you go to the slide, please? Can you show the slide? Great. I was asked just to talk a little bit about technology and provide some data. And I thought, well, you know, it's always good to reflect on history, because all of that's happening doesn't happen in a vacuum, whether it's political, social, what have you. And I know Michael Foyer, Dean of GW's Graduate School of Education, was on the was a director of the Office of Technology Assessment. And in the late 1980s, they published one study called Power On, and then in the early 90s, another one. But I wanted to kind of frame this in thinking about where we've been and where we're coming. And we started out with, in the 1970s, thinking about learning about computers. Like, actually, students would learn what bits and bytes were. And they were tested on that. And this was considered knowledge that they needed to know. And then in the 1980s, we kind of moved to using technology for drill and skill. So computerized learning, games, a lot of games were played, in particular with students in math and reading, and how to improve their math and reading skills. And then in the 1990s to the early 2000s, we started using them as mind tools, where students were actually learning with computers and using them to analyze data and demonstrate their learning. And now we've been moving towards learning influenced by computers, where computers can be used to predict, analyze, and actually teach us, where it involves artificial intelligence. And all of this does bring in some concerns and questions, but in the great scope of digital learning, I think the big questions are, what are the affordances of technology, and what are the challenges and barriers? And I mentioned those OTA studies because if you read those studies, many of the barriers and challenges that existed several decades ago still exist today. And so trying to figure out like what it is, where have we been and where we're going and where we want to be, I think we have to reflect on the history. You move to the next slide, please. Also, another I think big concern that I have had as an online educator is the fact that what students experienced in the spring was really emergency remote teaching and learning. It wasn't the online learning that I know and that I've been teaching and have advocated for many, many years. I also know that there have been several meta-analyses, and those are listed here, that have shown that there really is no significant difference between classroom-based and online or blended programs. Now, there are some things that, of course, are of concern with particularly some minoritized populations that we need to look at much deeper. But also, a lot of the research that has been done has focused on the technology and also what works. And I think later on in the discussion, I'll share a little bit about what kind of research that I think we should be doing instead. Can you go to the next slide, please? So getting into that challenge, one of the things that this particular quote highlights is that when learning online, there are certain characteristics that students might have where there might be more successful. So you think of a student who's successful and does really well and learns really well because of the way the classroom teaching is designed in a face-to-face environment, and then think about what kinds of skills they might need in a virtual learning environment. And I wanted to highlight this particular one finding because it does take strong management skills, literacy skills, technology skills for students to be successful. Now, it's not to say that we can't help younger students achieve that, but we have to teach them. We have to teach them, and we have to help parents understand how they can also help their own children achieve that as well. Next slide, please. Also, another thing that's very important, I think, to point out is that when we're talking about digital learning, online learning, there are all these design factors or dimensions to think about that Means, Bakia, and Murphy has written about. And as a trained instructional designer, my area of my PhD is in instructional technology. I know that design plays a very, very important role in how learning happens. And it also is really important to factor in when we're thinking about how we're teaching and how we're designing all of these, whether it's blended, face-to-face, how we're integrating technology. So what's the modality? How's the pacing? Is it self-paced? Is it class-paced? What's the student to instructor ratio? What is the role of the instructor? What is the pedagogy? Is it engaging? Is it passive? How is communication happening? Is the synchrony asynchronous, synchronous? I mean, all of these questions come into mind, and when we're trying to make comparisons about what works and what's effective, we have to keep in mind that not all studies take into account all of these different factors, and they are very important to consider. Next slide, please. So one of the things that Dr. Cohn mentioned already is the fact that we do have issues with digital inclusion. And this is from the National Center for Education Statistics. And it highlights some of the issues that you're seeing. And I'm going to share a little bit more data after this slide so that you can see kind of where we are now. But this is the Condition of Education's 2020 issue, which of course it's from data that's already a couple of years old, but still 88% had access through a computer of 3 to 18-year-olds. I'm sure many of you have seen news articles where you see like a picture of a family and there's 4 kids all trying to learn from one smartphone. To me, I look at that and I think, like, I just can't believe that's in the United States. I can't believe it's in my former home state of California that these kinds of struggles are happening. I can't believe it's happening in my own state and all over the world as well. Next slide. And dealing the whole question of equity and inequity. And we know that even before COVID-19 disrupted schooling as we know it, there were already access concerns, particularly with students in lower income households, Black teens, Latinos. If you look at this demographic, it raises a lot of concerns. And one thing that I do want to highlight, though, is that the digital divide, it's not just a technology issue. It's also access to instruction, quality teaching. It's also the ability to engage with others. So it's not just the tool, but it's a lot more than that. Next slide, please. And some of you may have heard of the homework gap. This is another aspect of the digital divide that had been being discussed even before COVID-19. And this is a snapshot from 2018. And again, you know, it kind of highlights the same kinds of findings. The numbers might be a little bit different, but still pointing out this, issues and concerns of high-speed internet access. Children don't have the technology, particular minoritized populations don't have enough of technology. And of course, rural students also another concern. We're very aware that there are rural technology deserts, internet deserts that exist all over the US. Next slide, please. And then part of what I was asked to do was share data. And I've been over the past few months, I've been looking at what kinds of data has been collected, what have people been studying, and it's really kind of overwhelming to think about and what to share with you all. So I thought it would be best to point out some of the different surveys by various organizations that have been collecting data. And I do have a handout that I've compiled that can be shared with you if you want links to the actual surveys and the findings of those. So you can see several major organizations collecting data about what's been happening with COVID-19. Next slide, please. One of them, for example, by Common Sense and Boston Consulting Group, you know, when I look at that number, 50 million K through 12 public school students taught remotely. I just, you know, it just blows my mind to think that many students and then all those kids in homes, apartments, or wherever they live, trying to learn from kindergarten, well, preschool, all, you know, on up. And again, this particular survey was highlighting many of the things that we already knew that were challenges. Next slide, please. Then there's the aspect of trying to learn from home, and everyone's different living situation is unique and different. And I think this quote, I think, highlights one of the challenges, one of the many, many challenges that students experience. And I'm sure many of you have heard of, you know, the debates about whether or not students who are in a conference, web conference, just like what we're doing, whether or not they should show their video or not. And you think of this situation and I think, my gosh, you know, I don't even know how a student living with 9 people could manage finding a space, a quiet space to try to learn, let alone to have a live web conference. Next slide, please. This is a snapshot of some findings by RAND, one of the RAND surveys that had been conducted. And here you can see where this really is very concerning. And this is one of the things that we do have to do, that just has to be different for the fall. I can't tell you how many discussions I had, not only with parents in my school, in the school district in which I live, as well as family members who had children who were not learning any new content. And I think from a motivation standpoint, if you're learning old content, how motivated would you be to even show up to class? And if you knew you weren't being graded, now I know we are living and functioning in a pandemic. But this, it's an eye opener as to how many students were not learning new content. What are the implications of that for the fall? What is it that we need to do to prepare those students? How can we help them? And what can we do with teachers so that they're prepared and teaching their own students new content? Now, I know there's an expectation that they do teach new content, but it's still astounding to look at this and see how many students in our country, of course, based on the sample that was surveyed, how many of them were being taught the same content. Next slide, please. And then, of course, we do need to hear from teachers and hear what some of their challenges were. And that's what this is also the RAND survey, one of the RAND surveys, where teachers were asked about what kinds of supports they needed. And I know there are a few panelists that have joined us as well who can talk firsthand about their own experiences and experiences within their school districts. So thank you all for joining. And you can see here that students, teachers teachers needed help to help students with severe disabilities. Also, they needed some guidance to help students with mild to severe disabilities as well. And one thing that I have seen also consistently a great deal in social media, how to motivate students. Now, if you think of students learning content that isn't new, and you think of the conditions at home in which they might be living, and you think of the social, emotional, the whole child, you can start to understand why it is that students may not have felt motivated, but still we have to go into the fall thinking about how is it that teachers can best support students so that they are motivated. And I think that's my last slide, if I remember correctly. So I just wanted to share, I just wanted to kind of give kind of a historical where we've been. There is tons of research. So it's really hard to say, in a nutshell, this is one thing, these are 5 things. There's a lot of data that I think a lot of us should be processing and coming to some conclusions. And I appreciate Carl's framing of 6 of the issues that he has noted with the podcast that he's been doing.
So Natalie, thank you so much. One of the points that you made that I think is missing from the conversation that is the evidence that you pointed to on the effectiveness of online teaching methods, because I think I've seen more on the negative than on the positive in the public press. But anyhow, our third discussant is Hiro Yoshikawa, who is a professor of globalization and education at New York University. And a fellow of the Academy. Hiro's research addresses public policies and programs related to the implications of immigration, poverty reduction, and on children's development. So Hiro, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hey, thanks. So following Carl and Natalie's focus on the current pandemic and the implications for learning, I'm going to talk a little bit about the context of policy that incorporates, I think, the response to the current pandemic through stimulus actions that have been implemented or are being debated, but then more broadly look forward to the policy options for the Democratic Party moving forward. And so this comes from my involvement over the last 3 months in a task force called the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force on Education, which was one of 6 task forces on areas of policy that Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden came together to agree to try to integrate and develop an integrated vision for policy in 6 areas, including education, to inform the Democratic Party platform. So I, didn't realize I would be involved on this until the Sanders side had actually nominated me. Each task force had 8 members, of whom 3 were nominated by the Sanders side and 3 by the Biden side. We, over a process of about 6 or 7 meetings, worked on policy recommendations in education with 2 kinds of documents, which we can share the final reports of the task force, one of which is written in party platform language and is so therefore kind of more general, and one of which is somewhat more detailed policy recommendations in the different areas that the platform language refers to. Co-chairs were Marcia Fudge and Heather Gautney, and the members included Randy Weingarten, Lily Garcia, Christy Vilsack, Maggie Thompson, Alejandro Adler, and myself. It was overall quite a congenial and collegial process. Bernie told us at the beginning to consult widely, come up with new ideas, don't just stick to my platform, for example. He really wanted an integration of ideas, and did say, do not criticize or insult Biden in public. This is a unity task force. We certainly started with the Sanders platform and statements that Biden had made on education, took into account other Democratic candidate platforms. And so I think this will be distributed after the call, but I just wanted to go over a little bit what was possible in light of these issues of the themes that we were discussing. So this process started in I think early May and ended in late June. And so this was clearly at a certain point in the pandemic, with recognition of the 3 pandemics of COVID, racism, and the economic crisis. And so we knew that there was emerging heightened inequality, that the roles of families and communities and the educator workforce and care workforce in shouldering the burden of these 3 pandemics was huge. And so these informed, to some extent, what would have been more of a solely future policy agenda, thinking across a 4-year period, to something that incorporated some aspects around response to the COVID pandemic. So I'm just going to quickly go over some of the main areas, and I'm happy to engage in discussion in the Q&A in case any of these areas are ones where folks would like to hear more. In early childhood, the 2 big areas of policy were this idea of a child care guarantee, going well up into the middle class, so that kind of perceived it was a unique moment to make a larger than incremental change in America's childcare policy. And the fruits of that were in the 3rd plank of Biden's economic platform, which were announced last week, which focused on care work, considering both childcare and early childhood, but also elder care and the healthcare, home health aid workforce, these aspects of the American economy, the essential workers who have been severely struck and yet are responsible for the learning and health and well-being of these kind of 2 ends of the lifespan, early childhood and the end of life. So the other in early childhood was universal pre-K for 3- and 4-year-olds with quality, the evidence-based approach to quality built into supporting things like the workforce. The idea of parity in these workforces in terms of salary recognition, benefits, collective bargaining, and those kinds of things between what K-12 teachers experience and what are the much more marginalized worlds of early childhood was highlighted in workforce supports. In K-12, What is in the language is a tripling of Title I, fully funding IDEA, assuring transgender students' rights in Title IX, addressing behavioral issues and disrupting the school to prison pipeline by having behavioral issues addressed by education professionals and not criminal justice. Recognizing the huge role of families and the expansion of resurgence of basic needs around food insecurity, in community schools expansion, this kind of expanded focus on multiple kinds of services, not just including family and community engagement, but thinking about schools as hubs for the COVID response, including a large expansion of mental health counselors to work with families and communities. Around issues of desegregation, first and foremost, reinstating and expanding the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education, facilitating solutions that involve transportation, magnet schools, in desegregation. On immigration, there's a whole separate immigration task force that I recommend reading the recommendations for that are, very progressive. In our task force, language on expanding bilingual education and ensuring and expanding safe school zones so that undocumented families that are mixed status without papers are not living in fear, and generally immigration families from immigrant origins are not living in fear of dropping their kids off at school for fear of detention and deportation. The notion that COVID has created a crisis for state and local budgets was addressed through school finance. The notion of school finance, I'll talk a little bit later about what we didn't get to in school finance. On charter schools, as you might suspect from a task force that had Bernie Sanders' platform as one of its bases, increased accountability for charter schools and banning federal funding for for-profit private charter schools. And also in a movement that really is continuing, movement over the last several years for sure, is reconsidering limited approaches like high stakes accountability and encouraging a multiple measures approach to assessment that integrates formative assessments, a strong emphasis on social emotional learning in the whole child, the Education Sciences Reform Act to provide an evidence base and consider innovations from the OECD countries. And finally, for higher ed, a strong statement on ending federal support for for-profit higher education institutions. The idea of a Title I for higher ed to address some of the financial crisis in higher education institutions and not just student access, including expanded grants for historically Black and tribal colleges and universities and other minority serving institutions. In a big important change, all community colleges being tuition free with this idea of a K-14 education system. And for student debt, not everything that Bernie had stood for, but for giving up to $50,000 in student debt for those in public services, canceling loans for public servants, teachers, or disabled students, forgiving all undergraduate tuition-related debt from 2- and 4-year colleges for debt holders earning up to $125,000 a year. And finally, for national service, recommendations for passing a pandemic response and opportunity through National Service Act. This is where I think support for the digital divide could be encouraged, in expansion for AmeriCorps, with youth engagement and reducing these inequalities that affect communities, particularly communities of color, targeting that to poorer neighborhoods with more essential workers and less broadband access, and adding college credit for that experience, for that age range. I'll just end with a few things we were not able to achieve in the language, which would be great if anyone on this call could work on some of these issues. So a COVID relief was included, but as you all have noticed, this is happening in these multiple waves of stimulus negotiation. And this idea of a financial stabilizer, which kicks in and is triggered when local unemployment rates reach a certain point, and would kick in automatically by the federal government and address these disparities in state and local government budgets and capacities, is something that's been put forward for unemployment insurance and SNAP, but has not been put forward as a proposal for education. And so that's something that is not in the language. There is not much in there, partly because of the timing around immediate summer action. And I think there's a lot that could be done still in the remaining weeks of the summer. And the scale of the community school expansion was not with the numbers that were in some of the candidates' platforms. Efforts to couple residential and school desegregation, which I think are a very important future direction for issues of desegregation. For example, places that are doing both housing zoning reform and acting on school desegregation. I think the federal government could play more of a role there. And the scale of national service expansion was not up to the level that some of the candidates expressed. So I'm going to end there and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Hiro. So you just gave us a lot more to think about, and now it is my pleasure to turn the floor over to Michael Buer, Dean of the Graduate School of Education and Human Development at George Washington, and one of the co-organizers of this. Michael is going to facilitate discussion, and I hope will leave us with all the solutions.
No, thank you, Becca. You were close there until you got to the part of all the solutions. It's very good to be with this group. Thank you for joining us. I'm just going to open this with a couple of quick observations about the flow of the conversation that you've heard so far, or at least what I've been hearing so far. A couple of reflections. Thank you, Carl, for starting us off with the perspective of not only someone such as yourself in the field still, but also with the added perspectives of the people with whom you've been interlocuting on your new podcast, because that's a very significant theme in what we were organizing for today's seminar, which is listening respectfully and carefully to what people in schools, whether it's parents or teachers, or for that matter, kids, are saying and thinking and hoping for in this moment of crisis. And indeed, I hope that we can, to the extent that the American Academy of Political and Social Science is essentially about the connection of research-based evidence to the improvement of policy and practice, we want to make sure that the questions coming from potential consumers of this kind of information are heard first and clearly. And so I thank you, Carl, for starting us off with these only 6 of the challenges. And I have a feeling that if we had had more time, you would have had 66 challenges for us based on your own work and experience. Natalie brought us more into the specifics of one aspect of what has happened in the crisis of the pandemic, which is, first of all, the distinction between emergency remote learning and something that she and others and other people who are part of our group this afternoon have been doing for a long time, which is high quality online instructional design and delivery. And just that distinction in itself, I think, helps us frame what one of the core issues is and what one of the challenges is, that for many children, this emergency remote or this emergency migration to remote learning has been a very mixed bag in terms of quality. And in the background, we have this knowledge from a lot of experience and a lot of research that when it's done well, good online instruction can really be a very important component of a successful elementary and secondary, and for that matter, higher education system. So thank you, Natalie, for alerting us to that distinction, and also for drawing attention to what one of the fundamental problems is that we have now once again been exposed to, which is the divide, which is the disparities, which is the inequality in resources, access, opportunity in the American public school system. Now, I just have to add a footnote here, which is, although some people like to use the cliche that I think Rahm Emanuel is credited with, you don't want to let a good crisis go to waste. We are unfortunately in a big crisis, and sure, we don't want to let it go to waste, whatever that means. But the truth of the matter is, a lot of us have been aware of and have been struggling to cope with the disparities and inequality in education. And frankly, we didn't need the pandemic. We could have continued to try to resolve some of those issues even without this dreadful health crisis. That said, it is important for us to think now about what we can be doing during and after this crisis, which gets us to Hero's very interesting sort of rehearsal of what went on in the Biden-Sanders negotiations, leaving aside, the politics for a moment. I must say there is something very optimistic about hearing this platform presented. This is a good example of where reaction to the crisis has led to people thinking very big questions, very big ticket ideas about American education and about the future of American education. And I think one of the things that I would love to use this occasion of this group together is to help untangle a little bit the relationship of short-term, shall we say, questions and emergency issues that are faced by people in schools and people who are counting on schools in the context of what we know about face-to-face and online instruction vis-a-vis the longer-term prospects for fundamental change that we may really be on the cusp of, once again, trying to get our arms around. I'm not sure if I'm being clear about this, but there is an aspect of the debate right now which sort of veers between short-term issues of how do we get the kids back safely and longer-term questions such as those on Hero's short list, including desegregation, equity in finance, elimination of student debt, national service, and other big ticket questions. So I don't know if that helps. It helps me a little bit to think about short-term, medium-term, and long-term issues here. Right now, all I want to do is call on people to participate. You have questions, comments, reactions to what you've heard. I think the deal here is that you don't have to identify yourself if you don't want to. You can just send your question into Jessica via the chat function. And if you want, Jessica can then say, we have a question from so-and-so, and then we will unmute you, or you'll unmute yourself. There's a new verb for the ages, to mute and unmute. Then you'll be able to actually identify yourself if you wish and ask your question or make your comment. So the virtual floor is open.
Okay, just a reminder, if you do want to actually ask your question yourself instead of having me read it, you can just do the little raise hand function in the chat feature, and I'll see it and let you speak. But so far we have a question / comment submitted from Yasmin Kafai. Yasmin, do you want to ask it yourself, or do you want me to read what you wrote?
I can read it myself. It just struck me, while I acknowledge that access in terms of digital devices as well as access to appropriate content are truly limited. If you really want to think over the last 40 years, a big switch had happened in the 1980s. Computers were only in schools. Kids didn't really have computers at home. Today, we have a very different situation. K-12 students are actively engaged online, just not in their classrooms. So I wonder, given that we have this disparity, is there a way on how we can leverage that kids are already online? Can we kind of pull this in for education to draw on what kids are familiar with, where they have experience with, and bring this into the classroom, which, by the way, I mean, is a strategy which many educators advocate on motivating and keeping students' interest.
Thank you, Yasmin. Very interesting question. I'm not sure if, well, I'll take a leap here and offer Natalie the first chance to answer that, because I know that Natalie has worked on issues of the coexistence of digital and more traditional forms of learning, what I think they call in the business the modalities. So Natalie, you want to take a step?
And thank you, Yasmin, for pointing that out. That is that's a very important observation, and one that I think it still concerns me, the idea that for some children, they have now multiple devices, and other children may only have one or none, or one that's like a hand-me-down that doesn't have the functionalities of all of them. So in light of the fact that most kids, let's say 12 and older, still have devices, I think there's still some issues. There's even issues between Android and Apple users. Some kids I've seen shut out of participating in chats because they don't have the same app as, say, another one who's has an Android or only basic text capabilities. But I think there's a lot that has been learned from the gaming community. I think of John Paul Gee's work and a lot of the other folks who've studied gaming, and I think that's one area. But then there's a lot that's been learned from the social media and adolescence and participatory research. So I think those are areas certainly that we can build from.
Thanks, Natalie. Jessica, are you? Yeah.
Yeah. I have a submitted question, but I see that Nia has her hand up, so I'm just going to unmute her for a second. So here you go. Oh, sorry, Nia, you have to unmute yourself. I'm sorry, I don't have to. It took away all my powers, so there you go.
I am the powers that be. Yeah, so I thought that was a really fascinating question, and I wanted to sort of build on what, from my perspective, what Natalie was beautifully articulating about general access to computers and limited access across different types of devices and modalities, and how those influence students. And so I should start by saying I'm Nia Dowell. I'm an assistant professor at the University of California, Irvine. And my research is primarily in online learning with a focus on peer interactions and how do we quantify and characterize different cognitive, social, and affective properties automatically as they're interacting on these different systems. And I think this speaks to an earlier point about, so even if it was perfect and everybody had access, the types of engagement that is happening across these platforms for students brings in another layer of issues around inclusion and equity in terms of, minority students not feeling heard or not feeling welcome to participate in these environments. And that's been quantified a lot in our research. And so I think Natalie in her talk also pointed out, so what can we do with data? And then I'm also connecting that to like short-term solutions that Michael brought up. And so I think learning analytics and educational data mining is a beautiful, it's a potentially useful way for us to start to understand how these things, or quantify how these things are influencing different populations and across different modalities and things like this. So it was more of a comment and building on. That's it.
Thank you. By the way, we are, I believe, recording this, and so your comments are all going to be very interesting, in particular when we have a chance to read and think and digest them somehow, even after the this event. So thank you for sharing those thoughts. Jessica, who's in the queue?
Yes, we have a question from Jim. And Jim, I'm not sure if you want to say your question yourself or if you would like me to read it. It's up to you, however you'd like to address it.
Well, knowing Jim Colmos as I do, I'm sure he's going to be able to give a very pleasant oration here. So go for it, Jim.
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you to the panelists and to all of you who organized this. It's really important conversation. My question is to Carl. I've been really, really concerned about the politicization of the school reopening decisions and how science has been pushed aside by some people. And to me, it just adds an incredible layer of pressure on an already pressurized, difficult decision-making process. And I'd like Carl to maybe comment on that a little bit more of how to navigate this now.
Excellent. I think, I sometimes think that if I were a saboteur out to make sure that schools didn't reopen in person, I would ask Betsy DeVos and Donald Trump to get in the mix. They are absolutely making this much more difficult for folks at the local level that are honestly paying attention to the science, trying to work through these issues. A concrete example from a collective bargaining conversation in a California school district. We want you to consider delivering online from your classrooms. Comment from the other side. Does that mean you agree with Secretary DeVos that what we did March through the end of the year was a disaster? And all of this heightened language and polarization gets in the mix. And the other side, the management side, is saying there are equity issues with regard to monitoring the delivery of instruction that we need to consider in asking you, while you stayed at home during the emergency March through the end of the year, if we're going to be at this for a full year, and we can guarantee that we will do the necessary cleaning and sanitizing, we'd like you to consider delivering this from your classroom that may well have better support and technology than what you had at home. DeVos and Trump are absolutely not helpful at all in terms of this kind of conversation, and it makes for what everyone sees as one of the things that comes through in the podcast is how exhausted leaders are at the local level. Why aren't you doing this? If there is a footnote that opens the door to in-person return for elementary schools, why aren't you pursuing that? The President of the United States, the Secretary of Education have talked about how important this is. So if you're not considering it, something's wrong with you. And so you can see how this plays out in the real world, how challenging it is, and how absolutely difficult these issues are for leaders at the local level.
Can I just piggyback right on that and ask Hiro if you wouldn't mind commenting whether in your work with the Biden-Sanders group, whether the general issue of the, shall we say, low appetite for science that we've all been experiencing is on the horizon for them, and then more specifically, is there something that you could offer as an additional answer to Jim's question about the politics of science here?
Yeah, we didn't talk that much, partly probably because the time frame for our recommendations is for November moving forward. So unfortunately, we were a little limited on that. There were certainly members of the task force who are very much out there in this debate, like Randy Weingarten. So there is certainly a very important role that the different stakeholders in this debate can play to counter some of the politicization that Carl was talking about. But also, interestingly, I think there have been these somewhat different statements from the American Academy of Pediatrics, and then recently the National Academy of Sciences committee, which I have to say I don't know all the details, except to know that there are some differences. So, and then more broadly, I think the issue of science and bringing back science evidence and research into education policy is certainly a sub-theme across some of the recommendations, where we highlight recent national reports on social emotional learning, on metrics for equity that incorporate not just these kinds of achievement and outcome-oriented disparities, but disparities in inputs and the experiences of education and the quality of education, which came out of the National Academy of Sciences committee. So I think those are examples of some reports, and then supporting the Education Sciences Reform Act. I think there will be a large agenda to try to build back the role of science in all aspects of federal decision-making.
Thanks, Hiro. I see somebody raising his hand. It looks a lot like Jim Harvey, but before we do that, is that Jim waving? But I think there was somebody else in the queue ahead of you, Jim, so if you don't, gotta make sure that I don't, skip over people here. So who's up next? Thank you, Hiro, by the way.
You can take Jim's question because it might be relevant to what you were just talking about. So I don't want to change the subject real fast. So.
Okay, you're responsible for my overstepping somebody. Jim,
so I'll take the blame.
So I just unmuted myself. I want to apologize for arriving late. I had it on my calendar at the wrong time at 10:30. So I heard what Natalie and Hiro had to say, and I'm afraid I missed Carl Cohn's comments, which I'm sure were terrific. And I want to thank AAPS and GW for organizing this panel. I guess I just have a couple of general comments. I think what the pandemic has done has exposed all of the fractures in our society. It's sort of, the inequities and the shortcomings of what's going on in our national life. They've just been laid bare for everyone to see. And I think that's particularly true around access to technology for students of color and for low-income students. I happen to think, I'm executive director of the National Superintendent's Roundtable, so I'm sort of a defender of public schools. I happen to think that local schools performed heroically in the midst of this. While national leaders were stumbling around, unable to get people face masks and unable to get nasal swabs, schools provided tens of millions of meals to kids, and they provided distance learning opportunities for, as Natalie said, 50 million students. Now, they may not have always done it well, and certainly we can improve, but I think the local performance compared to the national performance is exemplary. I'm a bit worried. I loved Hero's outline of what the Democratic Coalition is thinking of putting forth as an education agenda. I'm a bit worried that for 20 or 30 years, we've overlooked the forgotten half in the United States. Coming from a working class background, I know there are many, many students, and it used to be boys, it probably includes girls these days too, that really don't have much of an interest in going to a four-year college. But they have a set of skills that I would love to have. I can barely turn a screwdriver or drive a nail. And I'm amazed at the technical capacity of what would be considered to be relatively unsophisticated people in our circles that are able to do things that I'm not able to do. And I think schools have, and policymakers have lost sight of the needs of these children. And I would hope that the political parties could think of that. I don't follow digital learning closely, but I probably follow it more closely than the average bear. And I think that it would be a great help if we could get a clear and cogent and accessible description of the values and the strengths of digital learning, because my sense is that person-to-person learning is much more desirable than learning at a distance. And I know that, you know, everyone that has one of these things has access to more information than Nobel laureates had 25 years ago. But the fact of the matter is, you know, we're swamped in information these days, and getting help sorting it out, I think is important. And the final thing I'd like to say is that, you know, the Rahm Emanuel quote, which I never really cared for, don't lose sight of the opportunity to make real change amidst a crisis. The reality is that the crisis does open up the opportunity for us to make real change. A couple of years ago, Black Lives Matter was being dismissed. Now it's being taken seriously. Who would have thought last year that we'd be pulling down Confederate statues and removing the Confederate flag from the flag of Mississippi? So there is something afoot in the air where, if we take advantage of it, we really can strike out in new directions, and I hope we do that. So that's my little editorial.
Thanks, Jim.
I can read the last question that I have.
In your spare time, I think you should summarize all of that. And I have a catchy title for it. It would be A Nation Still at Risk. But we can talk about that later.
Okay, I'll do that.
Yeah.
And I have one more question.
Yeah, go ahead.
One more question. It's from Jessica Rigby. I don't know if you'd like to ask it yourself or you'd like me to read it, but you're unmuted, so I'm guessing you would like to say it.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, I'm Jessica. I'm an associate professor at University of Washington. I work closely with Ilham, who Carl was talking about earlier. And we've been working with local districts around how they have been responding, especially in the spring, and how they're planning for the fall around instruction. And one of the things that I've been really impressed with is how they have been really paying attention to students' experiences, particularly Black and Latinx and Indigenous students. And a lot of what we're talking about and what the nation is talking about and what a lot of districts are talking about are the technical aspects, right? Like, we need to figure out how to get kids technology. We need to figure out how to get them food. We need to make sure that they are logging on. But one of the things that has really emerged in the last 3 months is the nature of Black and Brown's kids' experiences in schools, and what Dr. Bettina Love calls spirit murdering, right? Like, there are some really non-technical ways, the solution to the experience isn't going to be found on the checklist. And so I'm really curious if the panelists can talk about this. Like, how are you thinking about, in non-technical ways, although I think there also probably can be technical solutions, but I think there also probably, we need to do things more than just, then come up with ways that can be turned into a checkbox. So I'm hoping that the panelists and maybe other participants, because I know a number of the participants in this call think about this really deeply and frequently. If y'all can talk about what are the ways that, that we can think about race in explicit and deep ways to not go back to the ways that school was. And so one of the things I wrote in my comment was talking about learning loss is an indication that we're not thinking about it, right? Like learning loss implies that the learning that happened at home is not valued. That's problematic. So how, yeah, that's the general idea. Like those are the things that we're thinking about, and I'm would love to learn about what folks here are thinking about that too.
So let me make a suggestion here. That is such a rich question with so much potential that we could put it to a vote and ask the group if we want to stay on this Zoom for another couple of hours to get all of the nuances out, or we could ask the panelists to really think about that question and maybe start jotting down some ideas for how they would go about answering it, and we'll include that somehow in whatever the follow-up is to this. Because I'm just afraid that, you know, we promised you until 2:30 Eastern, and that means we have about 10 minutes. And I don't want to give your question, Jessica, you know, short shrift here. And at the same time, I want to get other people a chance to talk a little bit too. So is that okay with you if we just put that set of questions that you asked before the panelists, and we'll try to follow up with some answers to this? Thank you. So we have at least, I think we have 2 more already in the queue. Let's hear them, and then let's see how much time we have left. Maybe we can go back to Jessica, we can go back to some of these other things.
Okay, I think they all might sort of be in the same sphere. So I'm gonna read both of them. And I'm sorry for not calling you all out to read them, but they're very well-written questions. This one's from Emily Dillard, who is the Director of Instructional Technology at Alexandria City Public Schools outside of DC. And she asks and comments, I have a question for Carl about learning pods. In your discussions with leaders, are there ways they are leveraging what they are seeing with learning pods to make decisions about how they address equity within their districts? Are these pods driving further discussions and actions that may not have been on the radar before? And the other question that was sent was from Emily Greenberg, and Emily is from the Urban Institute, and she asks and comments, so often schools are asked to do what other social programs might do because schools are where the students and families are. What now do the panelists consider promising opportunities for building bridges across programs and policies, and even for shifting responsibility away from public education to support students and families facing unprecedented hardships? So there you have it.
So I think, Carl, you were first up to try that pods question.
Sure. Yeah, and I think part of the issue, and actually today's podcast, which we'll post this afternoon, is with who really thinks along the lines of how can we seize an opportunity to actually make something that starts out looking like privilege and exacerbating inequality. What can we learn from that? So I think the question's a good one. I'm just not sure right now, with leaders struggling with regard to school reopening, how much good, solid thinking about reimagining is in the mix. And so learning pods might well be something. You know, I take back my irreverent riff about Invasion of the Body Snatchers. They might well be something that school systems could learn from if, in fact, there are some equitable resources associated with that. And are there ways to get that kind of enrichment experience in hardcore urban places as well as rural places where there's tremendous inequity?
Which, by the way, I think also relates back to Jessica's question having to do with learning loss, because if we're going to reframe that, not in terms of learning loss, but in terms of learning opportunity, then the question of what happens in these alternative modes, such as the pods, such as different kinds of online instruction, that takes a slightly different angle. So again, this seems to be converging on a very important theme about distribution of resources and the quality of what kids are getting in different kinds of settings, without specifying a priori that one is necessarily going to lead to quote unquote loss vis-a-vis other things. I'm not sure if I'm even getting close to what you were getting at, Jessica, but I was taken by that whole line of talk, so I thought I'd get back to it. Emily's question was about, say it again, Jessica?
I mute myself. So often schools are asked to do what other social programs might because schools are where the students are. And then we also have Professor Ravel, is it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Who wants to comment as well on that. So I will let Michael determine who goes where.
That's great, thank you. Okay, let's hear from our friend from the Urban Institute first. I think that's a question about schools not having to go it alone, and but you should restate it in your own words there, Emily, and then we can maybe connect it to what Paul wants to say.
Thank you. Yes, yes, the question is about schools going it alone and about new opportunities to leverage new resources, build relationships, and ensure that students and families have the resources they need to weather this unprecedented hardship.
Yeah, sorry I called you Emily, I meant Erica. Anyway, we got the right person. So who wants to take a stab at that from the panel? Hiro, I know you spend a lot of time thinking about the bigger picture of where schools are and communities and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think it's linking the poverty reduction agenda, the anti-racism agenda with learning. One example, I think, is this idea of care work, essential workers who are both have very precarious jobs and are responsible for the learning of young children. And so I think that linking those two has never been more urgent, right? So I think that's one example, but we should think much more creatively. The poverty reduction agenda, I think, around both job creation, access to education, improving and sustaining educational institutions, as well as addressing poverty through the kinds of long-standing issues that have not been acted on, like making certain tax credits refundable, expanding the earned income tax credit. There's a big proposal on the childcare credit last week from Biden, but I think there's a lot more to be done. And then I think on Jessica's point, I'll send around an op-ed that we have not been able to place that I wrote with Naila Nasir and Megan Bang, which is about this idea of rehumanizing education, which I think is a very, very big theme and a big opportunity and could be its own seminar series.
And then we had, I think Paul wanted to.
Yes, Paul.
Well, I'll just make a quick comment. I'm Paul Revel. I'm from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I run the Education Redesign Lab. You know, the two final questions were both triggered aspects of the work that we've been doing. In particular, we've been working very hard on the notion of children's cabinets. In other words, the idea that though we knew it well before this COVID crisis, it became even more apparent that schools alone are not up to the task of creating an equitable, equal opportunity society. And until we address some of these issues associated with poverty and associated with the overwhelming share of children's lives outside of school in which there are incredibly deep inequities, that we can't possibly hope that schools with 20% of their waking hours between kindergarten and grade 12 are going to get everybody back on the same plane, try as they must. So we've been promoting the work of children's cabinets, bringing together everybody in the community who has an interest in the well-being of children inside and outside of government, grass tops, grassroots, to take a broader conception of what needs to be done to build a cradle-to-career pipeline to build the opportunity for young people to be successful. So I just put that out there. Second thing is just sort of quickly, because I know we're short on time, is one of the things I read into this development of pods is the emergence of demand for choice in suburban environments. We've seen in the choice movement thus far, most of the activity happening in urban environments. We're now moving, I think, through this crisis in the modularization of education. You know, people doing their own thing in pods, families with privilege and access, drawing curricula like Russian math down from the internet, and deciding that may actually be preferable to sending their kids to school 6 or 8 hours a day. And I think, you know, if we're not careful, this is the emergence of sort of the, you know, a demand for the breakup of the idea that, that we send all kids to public education and that there are social purposes that go beyond simply the daycare and education purposes. So it's a trend. It's a trend of a potential workaround of the entire system. And I think it's something that we should be wary about.
Thank you, Paul. I think we're near the end here, so I'm not going to even try to do what I told Becca and Tom and Jessica that I would try to do, which is to pull some of this together into some coherent synthesis. That's going to take a little bit longer. I do want to just point out that for those of you who may not have seen it, Paul had a very interesting article in the Boston Globe in which he referred to the current moment as a Sputnik moment. Mm-hmm. And indeed, what part of this conversation reminds me of is the response to crisis has in the past in American history become the, well, no pun intended, the launch pad for some very major social, economic, technological developments. And maybe really this is, as Paul said, a Sputnik moment. My only concern is that getting somebody on the moon was easy and it took 10 years. I don't know whether we have 10 years to wait until we can fulfill the unfinished business of American public education, even with this Sputnik moment. So the business of the short term and the long term, you've helped me think about this a little bit more coherently, and I want to thank the panelists and all of you for being part of this. I hope we have more occasions to be together, even the old-fashioned way. And in the meantime, I will turn it over to Tom, our fearless leader of the American Academy, for some closeout remarks. Tom.
Yeah, I'll be brief. We're over time already. Things that Michael Foyer and I do together tend to come together slowly, but they do come together. So I want to thank all of you, particularly my quasi-boss, Rebecca Maynard, who's the chair of my board, and Michael for his partnership in dreaming this up. I had my own question queued up if we had time to do it. It had to do with assessment and accountability systems. If it's true, Paul, that we're moving into a modularization of education, then how can we anticipate what we ought to be doing, you know, state by state, venue by venue, much less what the federal influence is over accountability assessment systems. But we have lots to talk about. I think what we're going to do is figure out a way not just to distribute this recording more broadly, but to think about what we might do to continue this conversation. I'll be looking to my panelists and to Michael to think about that with me. I want to thank all of you, and as much as it's our mission as the American Academy to bring sort of research knowledge and informed judgment to bear on important political and social conversations, I think this just about hits the mark perfectly. And I want to thank all the participants for showing up and making the conversation so much more rich. If you have questions for me, I'm easy to reach. Thomas K, Thomask at upenn.edu. Specifically, I'd ask for your help in giving us people to distribute this recording to. Help us get the best distribution of this recording out there. So you'll get it all of you. We'll follow up with each and every one of you. Jessica does that quite well. But don't hesitate, please, to give me your ideas on who you think might benefit from this conversation, and we'll reach out to them. It doesn't have to be you, we can do it for you. And with that, I'll thank you from the American Academy. Greetings from Philadelphia, and on behalf of George Washington and Michael Foyer, I think we'll call it a day and bring this conversation to a close. You'll hear more from us in the future. Be well.